Have you ever stared at a blank screen and wondered, what in the world am I going to talk about on my podcast next? I have no idea. That is a very common struggle for a lot of podcast content creators. So, today we're going to talk about some strategies to come up with some creative ideas for your podcast and creating some of those engaging episode ideas. Welcome to Podcasting Unlocked, the show for purpose-driven podcasters. I'm Alesia Galati, founder of Galati Media, and I'm here to share actionable strategies to help you amplify your message and grow your audience. Hello, thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm so excited that you're here. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart because so often I get the question of what is the number one mistake that podcast hosts make? And this is it, is that they do not have a backlog of podcast episode ideas. Not to say that they have to have them recorded, but they just don't have any ideas of what they could talk about in a pinch. And this is something that can definitely contribute to pod fading, where podcasters are doing well, and then all of a sudden they fall off the planet. And you're like, what in the world happened here? Especially as podcast listeners, you understand this. You have probably had a few podcasts that you really enjoyed that just stopped producing content. And this is something that happens a lot, is that podcasters, they have all these great ideas when they launch, and then they get into it and you realize, wow, this is a lot of work. Podcasting and creating content and sharing the content and then telling your friends about it and telling your friends' about it can be really difficult. And so when you have ideas, it allows you to then show up consistently for your audience. And we actually have a podcast episode that talks about when you are trying to come up with content that, yes, consistency is king, but I believe that your capacity is the key to being able to consistently show up. And you get to decide what that looks like for you. You are the one who determines whether your podcast is going to be weekly or bi-weekly, or maybe you need to turn it seasonal. So when you are coming up with content, make sure that you're showing up consistently. And so brainstorming ideas kind of be the key to making sure that you're actually being consistent with your show. So let's give some of these creative brainstorming techniques of ones that I like to do that work really well for me. The first one is that I like to just get out of my house. And I know that sounds a little silly, but hear me out. I work from home and my husband homeschools our kids. And so we do not leave our house very often. Our kids are in MMA. They go every weekday of every weeknight. They go to MMA. And so that allows us to get out of the house for about an hour, sometimes 2 hours for that. But outside of that, we don't really go out a lot. And so sometimes I find that I could very happily spend anywhere from 3 to 5 days not leaving my house without even really noticing. And I found that when I am consistently staying in my house and I'm not shifting my environment, that my mood tends to not shift. I don't really have any creative ideas. I don't really have any new things happening in my mind of like, oh, this is a good idea and I want to do this. And so it's about getting out and having conversations with people or getting out and just letting your brain run free with any brainstorming ideas. For me, this looks like, because I have social anxiety, this looks like going to the park or going to the national park and going for a hike. And there are quite a few trails near me that are pretty great. What I love about that is that one, there's a canopy above me, so I don't have to worry about like getting too much sun or, getting overheated because their wind is blowing through the trees. You can hear the wind blowing through the trees. It feels really nice to just be out in nature. Maybe my allergies are a little messed up, but that's okay. And I found that when I'm in those moments, I have more ideas. And it allows me to then, when I get back to my desk, that I'm like, oh, I should write this down, or oh, I need to voice note myself. These are things that I want to do. And so that is something I like to do is just like a way to kind of shake myself, do something different is to get outside of my house. Another creative brainstorming technique is to take to social media. And I know we don't need to like take everything that our audience tells us, but maybe ask someone, hey, what is something that you're really struggling with? Or creating a poll to get some ideas from your audience on what it is that they are interested in hearing more about from you. Also, anytime that you are talking to your ideal listener or someone who is struggling with what you're talking about, make sure that you are writing those ideas down or at least reflecting on them at some point. So I did this recently. I did a workshop, and at the end of the workshop, and it was a free workshop, you can go access it if you want to. And it was all about coming up with podcast ideas and coming up with new content. What I really enjoyed was not even the workshop part, which the workshop was fine. What I loved about this was the questions afterwards, because there were only 3 people who showed up, which is okay. But those 3 people showed up and they had questions about whether it was the format or coming up with new ideas, but being able to take, hey, you can ask me anything. I talk about podcasting in a lot of different ways. So, what are your questions around podcasting? And I will do my best to answer them. And so, from that, I got not just questions about format. Someone was changing from season 1 to season 2, wanting to switch things up a little bit. Another person was like, hey, I'm thinking about launching a podcast. It's going to be in a pretty oversaturated space. What are some things that I can do to stand out? And another person, the third person, was struggling with, do I actually have to have a video podcast? And is this something worth exploring? All of those are topics that I can talk about on my podcast. And so being able to write those down and reflect on them, and I didn't write them down in the moment, but in my next team meeting, what I did was I said, here's how the workshop went. And these are the questions I got. And so that allows me to reflect back to say, ooh, how could I use this as ideas to really talk about this topic? Or maybe you are someone who maybe doesn't have an audience yet. You can go to some place like Threads, type in your topic, and you will get question on question of people saying, hey, how do I do this? Hey, what does this look like? And you might not use those exact questions as podcast episode ideas, but you can use it as a starting point to get your creative ideas going. Another technique that I have found that works pretty well is mind mapping. And what I like about mind mapping, and if you don't know what mind mapping is, it's like thought bubble that then turns into another thought bubble. And then what's related to that? This is related to that. And you kind of travel with this idea of like, this is the starting point. Here's what's coming up for me. And then taking it deeper and deeper and deeper, almost like asking why 5 times to the question. And so, what I like about mind mapping is that you have that central topic of like, all right, I want to talk about a specific topic. So, maybe you are someone who's like, all right, I want to talk about menopause because that's been coming up a lot lately, not for myself, but in the podcasting space and discussions. And so, okay, I want to talk about menopause. Cool. One, what have I already talked about? Okay, I've talked about a lot of stuff, but what is something that is coming up for me right now with menopause? Oh, my fitness. All right, cool, interesting. So, what are some things around the fitness that I can talk about personally, or maybe that I can have someone come in and talk about? I know I've been hearing a lot about weight training lately, and so I think that would be a really good option to talk about. Ooh, there's a podcast episode idea. Get someone in who does weight training, who talks about why weight training is important for menopausal women, and that would be an episode idea. But let's go back to the fitness. What about the foods that we're eating? Are there certain foods that we're not supposed to be eating that can help us to better balance our hormones during menopause? Ooh, there's an episode idea, right? And so I took that central menopausal fitness and then branched it out based on like, ooh, weight training. Ooh, what kind of foods are we eating? Should we be doing lots of cardio, right? Like there's all these different ways that you can take it. And so mind mapping is a great way to just kind of start thinking about some podcast episode ideas that you would like to come up with. Another technique that I like is to take an idea and then flip it around. So maybe it's something like the question that gets asked a lot is how to grow your audience. But what if we took it and flipped it and said, how to shrink your audience? What are some lessons that we can learn from that? Of maybe you have a very broad podcast and you're really wanting to niche it down and shrink that audience and get really specific on who you want to talk to. Okay, how to shrink your audience. Let's talk about that, right? Like, what are some things that we can do that? What are some lessons that we can learn along the way? And so being able to take an idea of something that your audience is asking a lot about, or that your potential audience is asking a lot about, and then flipping it around and trying to determine how does this relate to my audience and how can I use it to really help my audience understand things in a different way. And then my favorite technique is to stand on my soapbox. And what I love about standing on a soapbox is I think often we have like these like, "Oh, this is how I feel really strongly about this thing," but we don't talk about it enough on our podcast. We maybe mention it once and we're like, "I already talked about that." No, mention it again. Like, what is that thing in your industry right now that is, and not to be like a negative Nancy about it. No, like really giving clear indications of why this is a problem and why you don't agree with this stance and how people can do it differently, right? That's a very different approach than I hate this about my industry. And so standing on your soapbox as a way to really just say, look, this is how I feel. And something for me, just to give you an example, the thing for me on that is launching your podcast in 2 weeks or 30 days. I do not agree with that stance whatsoever. And I have a lot of reasons why, especially having launched about 30 podcasts at this point. I feel very strongly that giving yourself 2 weeks, especially if you haven't done any prep and it's just like a spur of the moment thing, that for a lot of people, the majority, right? There might be those individuals that it works for. We did have an episode where someone launched a podcast in like 48 hours and that worked for her. But I feel very strongly that if you want to have a strategic podcast that generates leads, that makes the impact that you want to make in the world, then it's important that you have a plan in place because you might get to a point of like, wow, I'm 10 episodes in and I actually don't like this topic. And so giving yourself that time, I usually say 2 months. I have episodes about how to plan out a podcast launch, and I go through what you need to be doing over those 2 months to launch your podcast. We'll make sure we have it linked in the show notes and the description. But that is something that I stand very strongly on is you shouldn't launch your podcast in 2 weeks if you're someone who wants to make an impact with your show and do it in a really strategic way. Not to say that you can't ever make an impact, but you're going to make the impact a lot quicker by following a more systematic way of launching your show. And that's okay. But I do have colleagues that are very open about launch your podcast in 2 weeks with us, launch your podcast in 30 days with us. And that's okay for them. But this is something that I feel strongly about, and that's okay too, right? So coming up with, and this is why it's my favorite, it's just standing on your soapbox, that thing that is really like, no, this is exactly what you need to be doing in your industry to accomplish whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. So now that you've got all of these brainstormed ideas, we're going to prioritize them. I think that it's important that you write all the ideas down that you have and then say, all right, I wonder how this will work. Let's test it out. Let's see if it's something that will be interesting to my audience. Is this something that I even want to talk about, right? You have to kind of filter it through those things. Also, is this something that is relevant for the podcast? Or is this something that I maybe need to do an Instagram live on? Or maybe I need to have someone come on and talk about this topic because I don't know that it's something I could do justice, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can go about prioritizing it and also filtering it through the lens of, is this for the podcast? So I want to encourage you that when you are feeling frustrated, one thing that I like to do to create space to be able to brainstorm is by batching ahead. And so what that looks like for me is I'm recording this at the beginning of May. The episode is going out in May. So my solo episodes are more timely with things that are coming up for myself, coming up for my audience. And I have guest episodes, which go live every Thursday, that are already pre recorded through the beginning of September. And so what that allows me is I don't necessarily have to interview people over the summer, and I can just let myself brainstorm. I can say, is this podcast still serving me? Is this something that I want to keep doing? Okay, yes, it is. This is a podcast I love doing. I love talking about podcasting. And so how can I make the most of this content as I'm moving forward? All right, this is how I'm going to do that. And so giving myself some space to brainstorm, that is going to really help you. Because if you are someone who is struggling with what in the world am I going to talk about this week for this week's episode, you're not going to have space to brainstorm because you're in a reactive mode of like, all right, I have to get this done and it has to happen right now. So give yourself some space, maybe batch ahead 1 or 2 weeks if you can. That way you have some room in your schedule to be able to brainstorm and come up with some new ideas. So I want to encourage you to do that. If you are someone who is struggling with brainstorming ideas, I do have strategy sessions that will allow you to sit down with me. We can talk through this. If you're struggling, if you're like, look, I don't know what to do next. What do I do? I'm here to support you. So you can go to helpmypod.com and you can book a strategy session there. If you would like, you can learn more about what it's like to work with me, as well as check out that workshop that I mentioned on brainstorming some more podcast ideas. All right. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Until next time, happy podcasting.